As Ukraine finalizes its preparations for its expected counteroffensive against Russia this spring, President Zelensky aims to increase military support from Western allies. More than 54 countries worldwide have pledged over 1,000 tanks and other armored vehicles to Ukraine. These countries delivered more than 2 million rounds of artillery ammunition and more than 50 advanced multiple rocket launch systems. The US is the top provider of military assistance to Ukraine, followed by the UK and the EU. Some $46.6 billion of military aid has come from the US since February 2023. The UK comes second with $5.1 billion and $3.3 billion from the EU. The European Council recently agreed on $1.1 billion in support for ammunition and missiles under the European Peace Facility. Germany took on the same plan, reversing its policy prohibiting sending heavy military weapons to a conflicted country since the Second World War. Bilateral aid provided by Germany to Ukraine totaled $6.80 billion since February. Most of the military aid provides weapon systems, training, and intelligence. Relative to its economic size, no nation has been more assertive in aiding Ukraine than Estonia. The small Baltic state has provided Ukraine around $396 million in aid, more than 1% of its gross domestic product. Recently, the United States promised to deliver Ukraine a new military aid package worth $300 million, including the Hydra 70 short-range air-launched rocket for the first time. This decision came a month after leaked top-secret documents revealed that Ukraine could run out of air defense missiles within weeks. Continuous military support from Western leaders reveals an urgency to help advance Ukraine's defense. How effective has military aid been to Ukraine? And will new military aid strategies be enforced? My colleague Harun Karcic will further discuss the Western military support to Ukraine with Sean Monaghan, a visiting fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Now, Sean Monaghan, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for agreeing to speak to us. Now, with an aggressive and expansionary Russia, military power is becoming a valued currency. Have Western European countries recognized that their approach to Russia has failed, that despite decades of dialogue, trade relations, and energy cooperation, deterrence and defense now seems to be the norm?
Yeah, hello there. Thank you for having me. Look, defense and deterrence in European security have really always been the norm. If we look back to the Cold War, deterrence and defense was really the kind of centerpiece, particularly US power, but European power too, and was really the force that kind of held Europe together, that protected Europe from Soviet influence, political, and from armed attack too. What we saw after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, was this kind of period in history which international relations scholars refer to as the kind of the interregnum, the kind of in-between period. The idea that actually this wasn't normal. The period of peace that followed the Cold War perhaps wasn't normal, the normal state of affairs in history. And what we've seen with an increasingly assertive and aggressive Russia under Mr. Putin, particularly since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and now with the brutal full-scale invasion of Ukraine, is this return to the center of European politics and security of the threat of violence, large-scale violence. And so this has been recognized by NATO, first and foremost. NATO last year at its summit in Madrid agreed a new strategic concept, which NATO does around every 10 years or so to set out its policies for the next 10 years. And what NATO did in Madrid was return defense and deterrence to the center of its policy, the center of its strategic concept. So yes, it's the return of defense and deterrence, but this is something that Europe is absolutely familiar with, that many had wished had gone away, but Mr. Putin had other ideas.
Right. Now, Sean, speaking of NATO's role in Europe, we have seen how the alliance is very much involved in supporting Ukraine. Has Vladimir Putin inadvertently reinvigorated NATO as an alliance?
Well, it's interesting. After the end of the Cold War, a lot of people ask, what is NATO for now? And there was a lot of debate and conversation about, actually, do we need NATO anymore? NATO focused on in the Balkans crisis of the 90s, Bosnia and Kosovo, and then after the turn of the century, NATO's mission in Afghanistan, Libya too. So NATO looked elsewhere and kind of filled a role of Europe's main crisis manager, if you like. Now NATO has clearly returned to kind of back to the future, if you like. NATO is back at the centre, at the heart of European security policy, in its role as the defender of Europe, as the guarantor that, the kind of transatlantic glue that holds US and European security together. NATO is the vehicle through which US and European military might is organized and gathered to deter Russia, to support Ukraine, and to keep Europe safe. So yes, in a way, the invasion of Ukraine, Russia's behavior has seen a renaissance of NATO, if you like, but really NATO hadn't gone anywhere. People say around here, if NATO didn't exist, then you would have to invent it. And I think NATO is clearly showing its true value, and that's what we saw at the Madrid summit. And looking ahead, at the next summit in Vilnius in Lithuania in a couple of months' time, we expect NATO to do a lot more and talk a lot more about strengthening defense and deterrence in the heart of Europe.
Now, since the end of World War II, the United States has been crucial to maintaining European security through NATO. But today, let me put it bluntly, can Europe defend itself without the US?
Well, that's a critical question. I think my answer would be it depends against what. So what can Europe defend itself against? If we talk about maybe first political warfare, so-called hybrid warfare, it's called grey zone aggression in the US, then actually Europe and the EU in particular has a lot of relevant tools. It has all the tools for the job. Resilience, cyber defenses, countering disinformation, countering kind of political interference. So, for example, the kind of Russian-sponsored attacks we've seen on the Moldovan political system, actually the EU and Europe are quite well equipped to cope with that kind of aggression. However, if we look at kind of step things up to armed aggression, limited attack, perhaps some kind of skirmish somewhere, it's hard to see what that might look like. But this is where Europe might struggle, essentially because after the end of the Cold War, European nations really disinvested in hard military power, and they sought to kind of gain what was called the peace dividend of the end of the Cold War, and they drastically reduced military spending for a good couple of decades, really until the start of the last decade, and particularly in 2014, when lots of warning signs, but Russia then annexed Crimea. NATO actually had a summit in the same year, where all the NATO allies agreed to increase their defence spending to at least 2% of their GDP, and many of them have done so. So, really there was a renaissance in defence spending, which has helped Europe, but still there are many serious gaps. If we look back at the operations over Libya, for example, really the US had to step in and provide a lot of air support, strategic transport, air-to-air refueling, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. And in fact, we saw some of the kind of similar pattern repeated in Afghanistan when European nations had to evacuate their citizens, and they really relied on US air support there to help them. So Europe has lots of critical capability gaps. When it would come to a serious armed attack, a full-scale war, then really the only tool that's going to do the job there is US military power and US nuclear power, the US nuclear deterrence, which really Europe, although Europe has nuclear armed powers such as UK and France, of course, really relies, as it did in the Cold War, on the US nuclear deterrence to deter armed attack, both conventional and nuclear attack against against European soil.
Now, Sean, let me play the devil's advocate and ask you, why would it be in the interest of NATO to defend and arm a country that is not a NATO member state?
Sure. Well, of course, Ukraine is central to European security and always has been. NATO nations have done a great deal to support Ukraine. The amount of military assistance provided to Ukraine is absolutely mind-boggling. Tens and tens of billions of euros and pounds and dollars have been spent, and the brave soldiers of Ukraine have used this equipment remarkably to fend off the Russian onslaught. But the defense of Ukraine is not something that's organized through NATO, because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. But that's not to say that NATO does not have a clear interest in defending Ukraine. It does. All of the NATO nations have provided military assistance to Ukraine. NATO itself has organized non-lethal support, hundreds of millions of dollars of non-lethal support and fuel and medical supplies and so forth to Ukraine. So it's really all hands to the pump. The military defense of Ukraine is first and foremost organized and conducted by Ukraine, helped by Western weapons and ammunitions. It's not organized through NATO, as I said, because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. And to a certain extent, if NATO were to get directly involved in this conflict, which was not of its own starting, Russia clearly started this conflict by invading Ukraine, and before that annexing Crimea. That might not help the situation. It might inflame the rhetoric. I mean, the Kremlin are already kind of blamed this conflict on NATO. So, NATO nations have to be very careful about stepping over that line. Where NATO has focused is on defense and deterrence of NATO nations, and clearly has been successful. There have been no attack on NATO soil by Russia, notwithstanding elements of so-called hybrid aggression, which, by the way, NATO has now included back in 2016, I think, as part of its Article 5 guarantee. And actually, we saw that when there was the attacks on the Nord Stream pipeline. NATO nations consulted with one another. Those attacks, of course, are still not attributed, but NATO nations consulted one another. So we can see the mechanisms at work there. But NATO is clearly behind Ukraine. NATO nations and allies are behind Ukraine for now and for the long term.
Now, Sean, I'm under the impression that it was East European countries such as Romania, Poland, and the Baltic states that first sensed a growing threat coming from Russia far earlier than the West. Was it because of their territorial proximity to Russia and because of their past experience within the Eastern Bloc?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, those nations those people have had first-hand experience of being occupied, oppressed by being part of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And, those experiences don't go away. That was only a generation ago. So, they were speaking with a loud and unified voice towards the Western nations of NATO and the US, saying, look, this is a serious threat. We really need to do something about it. And actually, NATO as an alliance of now 31, soon to be 32, then 29, I think, nations back in 2014 at the Wales summit after the annexation of Crimea really listened. And NATO established a number of military missions in those nations, in Poland and the Baltic states, NATO so-called enhanced forward presence missions, and they've been there, I think, since 2017. And in fact, last year NATO added to those missions. There's now 8 EFP missions all along the eastern flank of NATO. So, I think the voice of those nations has been really important, and the Baltic nations now, and Poland in particular, are really loud in calling for support to Ukraine, in calling for more investment in European defense. They're leading the conversation, and there's a conversation particularly over here in the US that kind of says, well, Russia's a busted flush in a way, because look at the severe losses they've taken in Ukraine. There's no way Russian land forces anyway are going to present any kind of threat to any other nation for the next 10 years. And actually, you know, those nations say, well, hang on, it's not that simple. Russia has the ability to quickly reconstitute, has, as we've seen, the ability to mobilize its population, and therefore, you know, we have to make some worst case assumptions about Russia, and we have to bolster the eastern flank. And clearly NATO has done that, and those nations are, you know, investing more in their own defense too.
Now, I mean, speaking on defense spending, Poland, Romania, and the Baltics are now spending far more on defense than West European countries such as Portugal and Spain, and they are modernizing their militaries. Are they spending more than the 2% as called for by NATO?
Yes, they are. So I'm familiar with the figures, and actually, so of the 30 NATO allies last year, actually 7 of them only 7, which is quite shocking actually, are spending more than the 2%. And Poland and the Baltic states are 4 of those. The others are the US, the UK, and Greece too. Romania is just under the 2%. I think last year it was about 1.75% of GDP. But all of those nations, Poland, the Baltic states, and Romania, have, you know, made political commitments to spend a lot more on defence. So the Polish government are talking about spending 4% of GDP on defence, which is, you know, approaching American levels. The Baltic nations have all said they want to go and spend towards 3%, and Romania have said they want to spend at least 2.5%. So those numbers are going up. So really, those nations are at the forefront of European military spending and investment. Yeah.
Now, Sean, I mean, you know, sticking to Eastern Europe, I mean, NATO's eastern flank is increasingly making its voice heard when it comes to European security, but does it translate into political influence yet?
Yes, I think it has. As I said, the polls, I was in a conversation only last week that involves some Polish officials, and they really are listened to over here. They're listened to by the US Congress, and so too the Baltic states. We see a lot of representatives from Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, you know, making these points about defense investment, making arguments that Europe as a whole needs to invest more in its defense. You know, along with others such as my own country, the UK, who again are spending at around 2.5% and looking to spend more, and you know, have been one of the biggest supporters to Ukraine, second I think only behind the US. The US too, many others. So, but those nations have really been at the forefront of the conversation. They have political influence in Brussels, in European capitals, and over here in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm. And finally, I mean, the EU has been talking for years about becoming an autonomous security provider. Have these voices been suppressed since Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine?
Well, I think the voices that call for a European army are mainly French voices, if I'm honest, and they've not been suppressed, but really nobody else is joining them in that chorus in your area of the world and in Eastern Europe. I think people realize that you know, NATO is a military alliance, the most powerful military alliance the world has ever seen, and it has US power. That's a big part of that. But really, NATO is the answer when it comes to defending Europe. When it comes to European collective defence, you know, NATO is the answer. The EU has a big role to play. The EU has developed as a security and defence actor and has come a really long way since the St. Malo Treaty in 1999, signed between the UK and France, which opened the door for a common security and defence policy in the EU. The EU has established European battle groups, which were never actually deployed in anger, but represented a decent capability in Europe. Those have now been replaced by the so-called rapid deployment capacity. So the EU has an ambition set out in the EU's global strategy, and now the EU's strategic compass, published last year, the kind of EU equivalent to the NATO strategic concept, that the EU must have a capacity for crisis management. And, you know, EU states are investing more in their defence, the EU has established a European Defence Fund, a European Peace Facility, billions of euros that have gone to support Ukraine, but also to support European procurement and cooperation. That's really important. But at the same time, even in the EU strategy, it does acknowledge that NATO is the prime actor when it comes to collective defence in Europe. And ultimately, it's about European capitals investing in their own defence. That's good for the EU, it's good for NATO, it's good for European security.
Right, Sean Monaghan, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
With the Ukrainian counteroffensive expected to launch in May or June, President Zelensky continues to meet with allies, pushing to gain additional arms. President Zelensky recently announced securing more weapons after visiting Finland and the Netherlands. At the same time, Western allies test their limits on how far they should provide military aid. High-level military advisors and a transatlantic group of former senior diplomats anticipate that the war in Ukraine will become a stalemate unless the West goes all in and increases its level of military support. The US and other donor states have been unwilling to provide Ukraine with specific advanced arms, such as fighter aircraft, out of concern that doing so could intensify the war. Some European countries, including France, believes that China remains a crucial player, potentially leading a diplomatic role to mediate the end of the Russia-Ukraine war. Other Western countries view China's role cautiously, while Beijing also helps Putin's war efforts, supplying non-lethal aid and permitting North Korea to transfer weapons to Russia. While diplomatic negotiations remain ambiguous between China and Russia, Western allies determine its next steps in military support and its competence to strengthen Ukraine.